So now here we are in the context of COVID-19, our current global public health emergency, economic emergency, much more than that. And it's exposing the failings of what has been a dominant patriarchal structure, but it is also opening up new avenues for resistance and for transformative change, we hope. I sincerely hope that we use it. Today also is Menstrual Hygiene Day, everyone. And it's no surprise that too many women and girls are unable to access what they actually need, what is their right in terms of products, support, services, and sanitation. And I just read today that 1 in 10 have been unable to afford the sanitary products that they need at some point in their lives, 1 in 10. So for me, even the denial of those kinds of services and the denial of opportunities and the resulting restrictions, discrimination that menstruating women and girls face is a form of violence. And certainly has strong links to violence against women. So back to feminist movements who have led the way in responding to violence against women and girls. We want to talk about what this looks like in the context of our current pandemic and in its aftermath. I don't know when the aftermath is. It feels like we've been going at this for ages, but in any case, we have a lot of questions that we're going to address about feminist activism in terms of how it's evolved and adapted to challenges and opportunities that have been presented by the emergence of digital technologies and social media, how this has helped or hindered our movements, how have we become more global as a result, how is this affecting or being affected by the current shift to online and mobile forms of outreach and service provision. I mean, even the way that we're communicating today and having this conversation virtually is an example of that. So this session, we're going to focus on the lived experiences of feminists who've been playing an active role in the fight for women's equality and inclusion in their regions. They'll tell us about their activism, about what drives them, about the key role that feminist movements are playing in achieving meaningful change in communities, countries, and beyond, and what we can do to support their efforts right now. Just in terms of logistics, we're conscious of power cuts, connectivity challenges, and all of that. So we'll be recording the first half of the event, not the breakout rooms, and a link to the recording will be shared with participants and found on the website and so on. Now I'm going to pass on to each of the participants to introduce themselves one after the other, where they're from, what brought them into the webinar, etc. And then we'll go through the agenda. So participants, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever we are today. My name is Fatou Wuri. I am originally from Sierra Leone, but I'm currently based in New York. And I currently work for UNICEF as an emergency specialist, looking at digital, looking at digital technologies and looking at innovative, the repositioning of innovative tools in humanitarian response. But really, my work is always at the intersection of policy, gender equality, and innovation. So I'm excited to be here and to add what little knowledge I have to the fantastic conversation we're going to have today. Over.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mendy Marsh. I'm a long-term specialist on working on violence against women and girls, mostly in conflicts and disasters, and currently am the co-founder and executive director of Voice, which is an organization that really exists to support the organizations that women and girls lead. In particular, during COVID, we're moving everything onto virtual work so that we can meet orgs where they are and support them with their real-time challenges that they're facing due to COVID.
Hello, everyone. I'm Miriam Sfer. I'm Nina's colleague. I'm from the Arab Institute for Women. I'm based in Beirut. So at the Institute, we work at the intersection of academia and activism. So basically, the work that we do tries to link these two together, where we try to bring activists and academicians to talk about issues related to gender and pressing concerns in the Arab world. I'm very happy that feminism and specifically movement building is what brought us together to launch this global discussion at these critical times, and I look forward to the exchange and documenting this exchange because it's very important.
Hi everyone, my name is Rasil. I'm from Lebanon as well, and I'm based here. So I currently work at Abad Resource Center for Gender Equality in Beirut, which is one of the leading experts in Lebanon on gender equality and gender-based violence. So what I do in Abad is mostly conduct research on how to better understand the needs of women and girls, specifically survivors of gender-based violence. And I also act as a focal person for the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. So I really try to understand kind of gender and GBV in the kind of humanitarian setting that we live in, which can be, as you know, quite volatile. It changes every day, especially given the current context of the kind of economic crisis and COVID and all the kind of crazy things that Lebanon is going through right now. So my one passion is trying to find the best kind of solutions and kind of ethical and practical information on how to best serve women and girl survivors of gender-based violence.
Thank you, everyone. This is Lena again, to run you through the agenda very quickly so you know what's coming. We're going to start with a Q&A with our awesome activists for about 20 minutes, and then we will automatically separate you into breakout rooms for smaller discussions for 20 minutes. And then you come back to plenary, report back, and so on. If you have your own questions, we encourage you to post them in the chat. You can get to them in the breakout rooms or Q&A afterwards. At some point, we'll be sure to answer them. But please discuss and engage. We absolutely look forward to it. Even though it's harder to do in this kind of a space, we had better all get used to it and make sure this is a conversation that includes all of us. So in terms of questions, Fatou, let me start with you. Could you tell us how are feminists mobilizing, and how are they resisting backlash by repressive regimes and by wider society? And how can we better support these processes?
Thank you, Lena. It's really exciting just to see how many people are here. And I think that is really telling to this question. It already answers this question that there's so many ways in which feminists and women are really resisting an anti-feminism and anti-gender rhetoric that existed prior to COVID, right? So we had already began to see a central role in the centering of right-wing ideologies, meaning the delegitimization and questioning of equality, basic rights and institutions that are really at the core of right-wing policies. And so we're already seeing those mindsets make their way into mainstream society. And so Sexuality Policy Watch is this great piece that really provides, in the context of COVID, a preliminary and partial overview of the anti-feminist and anti-gender rhetoric that rhetoric and forces that have positioned and are mobilizing themselves in the time of COVID. So all around the world, from Latin America, looking specifically at places like Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, what's happening in places like Israel, in places like Poland, where the Justice Party has used this pandemic to quickly approve a ban, to approve a total ban on abortion, etc. We're beginning to see how this has been positioned to basically reinforce oppressive systems. So in a recent article on open democracy, Claire Provaz basically said, in quarantine, we're all traditional wives, right? Basically what she speaks to is, in this state of abnormality and in this emergency, we're beginning to see how anti-feminist rhetoric and forces are reinforcing traditional gender roles, sexual dimorphism, and the rejection of feminism and sexual diversity. And so we were resisting before, and we're resisting even more now because we have no other choice. This is how we do so. Now, the way in which I framed this question is, the two ways in which we've been doing so has been through conscious building of feminist approaches to social change from an intersectional approach. And there's so many examples around that. But we recognize, and what COVID expounds even more, is that the institutional building, the mortar and brick, the breaking of the house if we need to rebuild it again, is critical to ensuring that we focus on consolidating and growing women's power, which this pandemic has demonstrated really is sorely lacking. And so the important lesson for all of us is, how do we continue, not just in crises, which are constantly forcing us, right, to wield power in a way that, at a pace and in a way that I think is really oppressive, is how do we build robust programs and networks and really institutionalize spaces of solidarity that we can count on, not only in times of crisis, but in times of quote unquote normalcy. There's so many examples of how this resistance is happening both offline and online. So I just want to give a quick example. I know I don't have a lot of time, but in Uganda, for example, as you know, COVID has intensified pre-existing stigma and inequalities that will always thrive in capitalist and conservative societies. But in Uganda, when we think about marginalized groups, women, girls, non-binary people, and within that population, looking specifically at sex workers, we've seen feminist mobilization, allies, sex worker groups coming together to jointly resist Museveni's government and the lack of services for sex workers. And on top of that, you know, we begin to also look at, you know, some of the lessons that are coming from African feminists, and maybe I'm a little biased being African, but African feminists are putting manifestos online, very much influenced and inspired by what is happening on the ground, by using digital platforms to make visible the frontline work that women are doing to care for their communities, right? And really making sure that is pervasive and that is endorsed and that is highlighted and that is witnessed and that is documented. They're prioritizing who is most impacted, because within populations of women, there's so much, there's a class, there's a racial, there are tribal issues. So which within this population are most impacted? And then how do we prioritize our resources and our support around that? And then the last thing before I wrap up, and I'm really sorry, 30 more seconds, is how do we take a feminist approach to leadership? Conversations like this, we can never underestimate their power, because they allow us to interrogate, share cross-sectorally, share cross-regionally, share good models around leadership, and which includes really thinking about self-care. And so you have that happening online and offline. And I think when we are the privileged that have access to these online digital modalities, it's almost our responsibility, and we see it across the world happening, to facilitate that sweet spot between analog and digital. So I'll stop here. Over.
Thanks, Fatou. I think you also answered the next question, which is how we can keep each other safe online and offline. So I'm going to pause on that, and if we have time, we'll try and come back to it. But Mendy, tell us how we can strengthen women and girls' participation in peace processes.
Thanks, Lena. I mean, it doesn't almost just make everyone want to scream that we still have to respond to a question like this, right? We know that when women and girls are involved in peace processes, we have more lasting peace. We know that there's more durable solutions. And we know that the most marginalized are incorporated and thought about, reflected upon. And I think that that's kind of the crux of it, right? Like, if we are creating spaces, opportunities, opening doors for women and girls to be part of these processes, then they will address issues across class, race, caste, ethnic divides, right? And we know that the most forgotten will be part of the process. And so we have to create, we have to prepare the ground. We have to help the communities, the world see that when women and girls are given opportunities to lead, that they make the change. We know they're doing that right now in relation to COVID. We have to help them create strategic alliances. We have to meet them where they are, where they have access to spaces, and bolster that. And we have to give them resources to do that. I think that we often put too much on their shoulders to generate change without giving them increased resources. And so we have to actually allocate and figure out how to get resources into the hands of women and girls orgs and the networks that they've built, whether it's local, whether it's at a national level, or if it's across regions. And we need to be bolder about our asks for getting the amounts of money that are required to really facilitate their access and their ability to lead in these processes. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yes, let's be bold in our demands. The time to ask politely has long passed. Rasil, can you tell us about feminist activism in terms of its adaptation to the challenges and opportunities that we have with digital technologies and social media, and how this has enabled our movements to become more regional and global?
So we know that kind of the existence of digital technologies have changed the landscape of feminist activism, right? It's become kind of a 24/7 thing. And we all know that we as feminist activists live with the cause, right? We're affected by it every single day, every single hour. But the existence of digital technologies have almost made it impossible to kind of step away from it, right? For better or for worse. For better, it's made it easier to engage with people from different countries who speak different languages, who have different abilities. It's made it easier to kind of share different types of media. But at the same time, I think that it's also made it difficult to take a step back. We all know that kind of activism can take a toll on people's kind of personal lives. And so it's kind of made it difficult to take time for oneself without being engaged all the time on the phone, on Twitter, on Facebook. So that being said, activists have kind of, as collectives and individuals, have found ways to both reach people, but also found ways to support each other and to stay safe, like we were talking about in the previous question. So one example of this kind of feminism, of this kind of activism is Megan Crab. I don't know if you guys know her. She goes by the Instagram handle of Body Posy Panda. She was like these little brackets. So in case you can't actually read her captions, these little brackets will read them out for you if you have a specific software for that. And another example of an activist is Nadine Jouni, who used to work in Abad. She passed away last year. So she used to fight for custody rights in Lebanon, where the kind of sectarian and religious courts don't allow women to have their children if they get divorced. And so one of her main approaches to do that was to do that on Facebook, and she reached so many people who couldn't actually make it physically to the spaces that she was protesting, and that allowed her to reach a lot of people. But that being said, a lot of people don't have access to digital technologies. So a good question to ask is, who are we leaving out? Especially in times like this where everything has become online and it's very difficult to meet in person and it's almost impossible to meet in groups. So who are we leaving out? And I think that's a question that we need to kind of think about ways of including people by providing them with resources, like Mendy was saying, and kind of think of the best ways to do that without kind of being kind of exclusive in our work. So I think I'm going to stop there just so I don't go over the 3 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you. Miriam, so we know that feminist movements have led the way in responding to violence against women and girls, but what did this actually look like in the current context and its eventual aftermath?
Thank you, Lina. So I'm going to talk in general and then framework it and talk about the demands of the women's rights movement and the movement in general with regards to the October Revolution and everything that was called for. So as we know, throughout, within the context of Lebanon and even on the level of the Arab world, the feminist movement has always led the way in the direction of like trying to get all the rights for women and to counter everything related to violence against women and girls and their communities. So there has been a very hard work done to trigger the discussion and move it from the personal realm to the public realm. And this is exactly what happened within the context of the October Revolution. So everything that women had demanded on the level of Lebanon previously was reiterated on the streets, where most of the reservations that were entered to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and that feminist and women's rights groups were fighting for within the context of the reports that they were writing, the shadow reports, were reiterated on the streets, where women started talking about having a civil state, and just like Rasil said, and everything that Nadine Jouni and a lot of other activists have worked on in terms of personal status codes and women losing custody, etc. They called for having a quota system and called for not just women's representation and playing it as a gender card, but also having women's representation where women actually push for the feminist movement, feminists that occupy the seats and nothing less. They also called for nationality rights, countering gender-based violence, and specific amending existing laws that basically fight for a removal of all discrimination against women. One of them is domestic violence and violence against women in general. They called for also, so here we see how the shift happened on the street, where all marginalized groups and vulnerable groups were not excluded, the rights of sexual orientation. The LGBTIQ community was very vocal on the street, the right of migrant domestic workers and all other refugees, the fact that the kafala system should be abolished and how demeaning the kafala system is and how we should get rid of it. So the sexual and reproductive health and rights and why it's important to address them. So all these rights were pushed forward by the feminist movement and by feminists, and this is how they build momentum in terms. And a lot of people joined simply because, as you see, thanks to the work that all our foremothers have done, and thanks to the activism that took place on the street, a lot of gains have took place. We still have a long way to go, but like acknowledging the rights of marginalized groups and vulnerable groups on the street in Beirut, and over and above that, discussing all the violent practices that happened at the time of the war, and the right of people to know what happened to their loved ones at the time of the war, was something very interesting that happened on the streets. Over and above that, women's rights groups discussed openly a lot of things related to gender rights, and a lot of people from all over Lebanon were attending these talks in the different geographical areas where they were taking place, and they moved the discussion from the home or from elitist rooms or academic setups or NGO setups to the street. I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Miriam. Next question, Rasil and Fatou together. Tell us how this situation is affecting or has been affected by online or mobile forms of outreach and service provision.
Yeah, thank you. So just a heads up that in Lebanon right now, everything has become online. So we've kind of stopped all group activities related to provision for like responding to gender-based violence. So everything except for very kind of severe cases of case management have become online. And so we've basically been providing women with data bundles, because we know that not everyone has access to enough resources to buy those data bundles for 3G or 4G, and there's not enough Wi-Fi in Lebanon to sustain this kind of work. So we've been buying bundles for those who have phones, which is a good kind of number of people. And we've been doing everything online. But also there are a lot of people who I think a lot of women who I think are being left out of online service provision. And I think someone correct me if I'm wrong, there are a lot of migrant domestic workers who live in the same kind of environment as their employers and aren't really able to kind of speak on the phone, and a lot of survivors of GBV who live with the perpetrators. And so this has kind of made service provision quite difficult, and we've been kind of dealing with the challenges of that. But I think that I'm going to let kind of Fatou jump on in case you want to add anything.
Rasil, thank you so much for that. And just hearing what you do is just incredibly inspiring. And I love the question that you keep asking all of us, which is, who are we leaving out? Who isn't included in this? And I think that's a very important question, because it beckons and requires that we are intentional about really supporting offline mechanisms, that our referral pathways to service delivery, to quality service delivery for women, for victims, those experiencing violence are really, really clear, and they're feeding into one another. The other thing I want us to think about, since I love your question, is how do we as feminists in our positions of power, in our positions of privilege, what can we do within our institutions to also support these types of efforts, right? So in my current role, looking at innovations in general, a lot of the chatbots, we've built a global chatbot on COVID, right? We've reached 6 million people, 50 countries, etc. But but the platforms, the technologies were never designed for women and girls to begin with. And so because it's really important to me that, you know, we didn't do this for girls and with girls and for women, we expect the technology just to work for them. I try to work with the right experts, and I try to be very intentional in my programmatic interventions that we are creating from a technological perspective, safeguarding features that can make our chatbots safer for anyone that wants to report violence, and that they are referred accordingly and we can follow up with them. I make it very clear that in all our programming, we have to be able to work with our our GBV experts in the office, so that we are thinking not only at the technology, but in any programmatic intervention, we're taking into consideration the needs of women and girls. So that is how, in my own way, working within a bigger institution, and there are people who do this, this is their bread and butter, but sitting cross-sectorally, looking and interrogating technologies, it's to ensure that the products that we're producing are sensitive, are applicable, and at least we're wielding them to better serve survivors of violence or those experiencing it. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. These are such rich answers. Mendy, let's talk about regional commonalities and synergies in the movements. So we know that we don't restrict to national borders, but how is this work affected by changing migration policies and travel restrictions in our new reality?
Yeah, I think the big thing that I've been reflecting on is that we have to continue to understand how COVID and the changing migration policies and restrictions are really affecting the work, the feminist work that women and girl-led orgs have been doing historically and are currently trying to do it. We have to hear from them. We have to create ways to really understand what is happening to them. What does this look like for women and girls in the countries where they're living? What does it look like at a more local community level, right? And because if we don't understand that first, then we can't continue to support sort of our feminist movement building, right? And we can't identify what those real synergies are without that true understanding. And I think that even though we have more kind of understanding and there's more profile on the reality of how COVID is affecting women and girls and exacerbating pre-existing inequalities and violence against women and girls, we still need to kind of understand what that really looks like in relation to movements and ability to make to continue with the work. I mean, a lot of the organizations that we've been speaking to are they're doing things really, they have to do things really differently, as others have already said, right? But we really have to understand how they are still able to mobilize what's working in one country and what's not working in another. So creating spaces for these groups to, if they can be on calls together like this, to share those realities. You know, I was on one call recently where we had women from Uganda, women from Kenya, women from the Northern Caucasus on the line, and to really give them space to talk about what they were still able to really do, and to find ways where they could actually do advocacy together and create opportunities to really identify things that they can continue to do together. Another example that from a group from Colombia that we've been talking to on a weekly basis is how they feel like they actually need to go back to times before there was so much digital work and really understand how they were able to generate movements with women before there was so much online work, because that still leaves so many women out, right? So really coming up with different ways to continue movement building within new constraints that exist. I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Building on this theme of who's left out and how do we make sure that they're not left out, Miriam, marginalized groups, how are they engaged in our movements? And tell us specifically about refugees, minority women, female migrant domestic workers, and all of those that historically have been left out but are fundamental to the work that we do.
So as I previously said, there has been a shift, and women's rights groups general women's rights groups used to think, this is my opinion, that like human rights are a basket where you can pick and choose stuff from them, and they used to like sideline certain issues that they don't think are pressing. I was once at a very high level meeting where somebody on the high end was talking about migrant domestic workers and like criticizing them, and this was somebody in basically in a high place up, and she was saying like really ridiculous stuff. So what I'm trying to say is that the mentality has shifted. People on the ground, this movement is grassroots. It's calling for changes on all counts. At the time of the revolution, you saw people directly and expressing very vehemently the right to sexual pleasure, the right of the LGBTIQ community, the right of refugees, migrant domestic workers. Now, unfortunately, COVID-19 has basically created a lot of like has exacerbated everything that these marginalized groups and vulnerable groups go through. Rasil has already spoke about the work that they do. Abad, Kafa, and a lot of other organizations, RDFL, are doing amazing work in terms of like showcasing the numbers and attending to all these victims of domestic violence. On the level of migrant domestic workers, they're at a great risk. They no longer, for instance, have days off. Over and above COVID-19, we have a huge economic crisis in Lebanon. The fact that there is no dollar to give these women and to pay these workers for the work that they're doing, and for them to be able to send this money back home, and for them to know about actually what's happening, how safe they are, and why they're confined to the home, just like the employers. So there are a lot of things that are happening. Victims of trafficking and sexual exploitation are very vulnerable. Their health risks are very many, and traffickers and pimps do not care. All they care about is like generating money. So they are operating under a lot of a lot of precarious situations. The LGBTIQ community that are isolated within the context of homophobic and transphobic families, where they run the risk of being abused, etc. They're not used to that. People with physical and intellectual disabilities, the elderly, etc. So like everything that's happening, even violence against children. So everything that's happening, we just heard so many cases on femicide, on a girl, a 6-year-old girl in Tripoli was killed not too long ago. There's so many cases of femicide coming out of Lebanon. So this pandemic has exacerbated a lot of the violations that women undergo in general, and in specific, vulnerable groups are suffering the most, and there's a lot to be done.
Absolutely right. There is a lot to be done.
A great final thought. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.